Google Earth updates a riverbank, exposing a car that's been missing since 1995. The dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light of the attic, a silent, swirling galaxy stirred only by the hum of the old desktop computer. Leo, of 16 years old and perpetually bored, was supposed to be cleaning out the space, a punishment for a report card that had been less than stellar. But the siren song of the internet, even on this ancient wheezing machine, was too strong to resist. He wasn't on social media or playing games. He was on Google Earth, his own private time machine. He'd spent hours visiting the pyramids, the Great Wall, the neon-drenched streets of Tokyo. Now he was flying over his own small town of Harmony Creek, Oregon, a place where nothing ever happened. He zoomed in, the satellite image sharpening, resolving into the familiar grid of streets, the green smear of the town park, the silver ribbon of the Calliope River that snaked along the town's western edge. He followed the river north, past the old lumber mill, past the Lover's Leap lookout, to a place the locals called the Tangle, a dense, marshy thicket of woods that was all but impassable on foot. It was a place of ghost stories and teenage dares. A place you didn't go alone. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just an anomaly, a shape that didn't belong. A pale oblong form half submerged in the muddy bank, almost completely obscured by the overgrowth of willows and thick brush. It was unnaturally straight-edged against the wild organic chaos of the tangle. He clicked, zoomed, the pixels struggling to resolve. It looked like the roof of a car. A pale, sickly yellow car. A cold prickle, entirely unrelated to the attic's chill, traced a path down his spine. He wasn't a car guy, but he knew this one was old. The shape was classic, rounded, from a time before everything was a silver or black SUV. He toggled the timeline feature, a tool he'd discovered by accident. He slid the bar back. 2022, 2018, 2015. The shape was there, a little more exposed. The riverbank eroded slightly. 2010, still there. 2005, still there. He slid the bar all the way to the left, to the earliest available image. 1998, the car. Was there a ghostly shape, half swallowed by the earth and water? An idea, absurd and thrilling, sparked in his mind. He remembered the town's one enduring mystery, a story whispered at campfires and spoken in hushed tones by the adults. The disappearance of Sarah Jenkins. It had happened years before he was born, in 1995. A 17-year-old girl, the prettiest in her class, had vanished after the homecoming dance. She'd been driving her father's car, a freshly restored 1968 Ford Mustang, pale yellow. Buttercup, she'd called it. No trace of her or the car had ever been found. Leo's breath hitched. He stared at the screen, at the ghostly shape on the riverbank. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. A trick of the light, a glitch in the satellite data. But the shape was so clear. The color, even faded and mud-caked, was a pale, distinctive yellow dot. His heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't a game anymore. He took a screenshot, his hand trembling slightly. He printed it, the old inkjet printer groaning in protest, spitting out a grainy, pixelated image of the tangle. He stared at the picture, the dark smudge of the car, a cancerous blot on the landscape. He had to tell someone, but who? His parents would dismiss it as another of his flights of fancy. His friends would laugh. The police, what would he say? I was messing around on Google Earth, and I think I found a car that's been missing for 27 years. They'd think he was a crank. But the image burned in his hand. The story of Sarah Jenkins was a town legend, a cautionary tale. She'd been the golden girl, the prom queen, dating the town's golden boy, a handsome, popular athlete named Will the Thrill Peterson. He was the last one to see her alive. He'd told the police they'd had a small argument after the dance, and she'd driven off in a huff. He was heartbroken, he'd said. The whole town had mourned with him. He was a hero in the search parties, his face etched with worry, pleading for any information. But as weeks turned into months, and months into years, the hope had curdled. into a permanent, low-grade sorrow that settled over Harmony Creek, like the perpetual Oregon mist. Leo folded the paper, his mind racing. The tangle was less than 3 miles from his house. He knew the trails that led to the edge of it, the ones he and his friends used for illicit bonfires. He could be there in 45 minutes on his bike. It was a stupid idea, a dangerous idea. The tangle was treacherous, full of sinkholes and venomous snakes, or so the stories went. And if it was the car, what would be inside? The thought sent a wave of nausea through him. He imagined the dark, silty water, the rusted-out shell, the things that would have grown and nested in the dark over 27 years. He imagined bones. But the image on the paper was a siren call. It was a secret, a real-life mystery, dropped right into his lap from a satellite in the sky. It was the most important thing that had ever happened to him. He stuffed the printout into his pocket, grabbed his phone and a flashlight, and crept down the attic stairs. He scribbled a hasty note for his mum, gone to library. Be back for dinner, and slipped out the back door, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long, eerie shadows across the manicured lawns of his neighborhood. He got on his bike and pedaled. The quiet suburban streets giving way to the cracked asphalt of the county road that led out of town, towards the river, towards the tangle, towards a pale yellow tomb that had held its secrets for nearly 3 decades. The air grew cooler as he neared the river, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filling his lungs. He ditched his bike. At the trailhead, the familiar path now feeling alien and menacing. The trees closed in around him, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the fading sky. The hum of the town disappeared, replaced by the buzz of insects and the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. He followed the trail until it dissolved into a muddy, vine-choked morass. This was the edge of the tangle. He pulled out his phone, the Google Earth app, a glowing beacon in the growing dark. He had to triangulate, use the river's bend and a distinctive cluster of birch trees as landmarks. He pushed his way through thorny bushes, his jeans catching and tearing, his face stinging from whipping branches. The ground grew soft, sucking at his sneakers. A chorus of frogs began their evening dirge. He checked the phone again. He was close. He could smell the stagnant, metallic scent of the river mud. He swept the beam of his flashlight over the dense foliage, the light catching on 1,000 glittering spiderwebs. And then he saw it. Through a gap in the willows, a glint of metal. Not a smudge on a screen, but a real, solid thing. His breath caught in his throat. He scrambled forward, his feet sinking into the muck. He pushed aside a curtain of hanging vines, and there it was, the car. It was worse than he could have imagined. It was tilted at a grotesque angle, its nose buried deep in the black, oily mud of the riverbank. The pale yellow paint was blistered and peeling, great patches of it eaten away by rust that bled down its sides like dried blood. The windows were gone, shattered or rotted away, leaving gaping black mouths. The interior was a nightmare of mud and weeds and things he didn't want to identify. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, as if someone had tried to get out. He stood there, frozen, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The silence of the tangle pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. This was real. A real car. A real tomb. Sarah Jenkins' tomb. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run. To get back to the safety of his brightly lit house, to unsee what he had seen. But he was rooted to the spot, held captive by the horror and the history of it. He took a hesitant step closer, the mud squelching around his ankles. He had to be sure. He had to see inside. He raised the flashlight, aiming the beam through the empty space where the driver's side window had been. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the mud-caked dashboard, the steering wheel thick with algae. He swept the beam across the passenger seat, and then to the floor. And then he saw them, not bones. Not a skull, something else. Lying on the floor mat, half buried in the silt, was a pair of shoes. Small, delicate, white heels, the kind a girl might wear to a dance. They were caked in mud, but he could still see the small sequined bow on. The toe of one of them. A wave of dizziness washed over him. He stumbled back, his foot catching on a root. He fell hard, landing in the cold, wet mud. He scrambled backward, away from the car, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm. He had to get out of there. He had to tell someone he was on his feet, turning to run, when a sound stopped him dead. A twig snapped behind him. Leo froze, every muscle in his body screaming. He wasn't alone. The sound was close. Too close. He held his breath, straining to listen over the blood roaring in his ears. The frog chorus had gone silent. The woods were watching. Slowly, terrified of what he might see, he turned his head. He swept the flashlight beam back the way he had come, across the gnarled trees and hanging vines. The beam landed on a figure, standing not 20 feet away, partially hidden behind the trunk of a massive oak dot. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by shadow. He was perfectly still, watching Leo. He wasn't a hiker. He wasn't a lost teenager. There was an aura of cold, deliberate stillness about him that made the hair on Leo's arms stand on end. "You shouldn't be here," the man said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the damp air. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat. Leo's mind went blank with terror. He couldn't speak, he couldn't move. The flashlight slipped from his numb fingers, its beam skittering across the ground before extinguishing with a soft thud. He was plunged into near-total darkness, the only light, the faint, ghostly glow from his phone screen, still clutched in his hand. The man took a step forward, the shadow detaching itself from the tree. Leo could see him more clearly now. He was older, his face weathered and hard, his eyes like chips of ice in the gloom. He was wearing a dark jacket and work boots, caked in the same black mud as the riverbank. He looked like he belonged in this dark, forgotten place. "What did you see?" the man asked, his voice dangerously soft. Leo's phone suddenly felt like a lead weight. The screenshot, the location, the proof, it was all on that device. The man took another step, and Leo finally found his voice, a choked, pathetic whimper. "Nothing," he whispered. "I saw nothing. I was just lost." The man smiled, a slow, cruel curving of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "Lost," he repeated, the word a mockery. "People get lost in the tangle. Sometimes, they don't get found." He took another step. He was only 10 feet away now. Leo could smell the stale scent of sweat, and river water, and something else, something acrid and chemical. He saw the man's hands. They were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred. One of them was clenched into a fist, Leo knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the mud beneath him, that this man was not going to let him leave. He was connected to the car. He was the reason it was here. He was the reason it had stayed hidden for 27 years. The man lunged. Leo screamed. A raw, primal sound of pure terror. He turned and ran, blindly, crashing through the undergrowth, thorns and branches tearing at his skin and clothes. He didn't know where he was going. He just ran, fueled by adrenaline and a terror so profound it was a physical pain. He could hear the man behind him, crashing through the woods with an unnerving speed. His heavy footfalls like the beats of a death drum. "There's nowhere to run, boy." The man's voice boomed through the trees. Leo risked a glance over his shoulder. The man was gaining on him, a dark, relentless shape moving through the twilight. He was going to catch him. He was going to kill him. Right here, in the dark, where no one would ever find him. Just like Sarah Jenkins, he burst out of the trees and onto the muddy trail, his lungs burning, his legs screaming. He saw the faint outline of his bike, a symbol of a world he was desperate to get back to. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers, slick with sweat and mud. He had to call 911. He had to leave a trail. He swiped the screen, his thumb slipping. The man was almost on him. He could hear his ragged breathing. Leo finally managed to unlock the phone, his finger hovering over the emergency call button. He never got to press it. A hand clamped down on his shoulder, spinning him around. The man's face was inches from his. his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fury. He snatched the phone from Leo's hand, his grip like a vice. "I told you," the man snarled, his voice a low, guttural growl. "You shouldn't have come here." He raised his other hand. There was something in it. Something heavy and metal. A tire iron. The last thing Leo saw was the glint of the fading light. On the raised weapon, a final terrible star in the encroaching darkness. Then, the world exploded into a universe of white-hot pain, and then, nothing at all. The silence of the tangle returned, broken only by the chirping of the frogs and the gentle lapping of the Calliope River against a pale yellow, forgotten tomb. And now, it held a new secret. The fluorescent lights of the Harmony Creek Sheriff's Department hummed a monotonous, soul-crushing tune. Detective Frank Miller, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weariness of seeing the worst of his small town, stared at the missing person report on his desk. Leo Miller, his own nephew, the photo, a goofy school picture, stared back at him, a painful reminder of the bright, inquisitive kid who was now just a name on a piece of paper. It had been 24 hours. A lifetime. His sister, Maria, sat opposite him, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask of sleepless dread. She'd been a rock, a force of nature, but the last day had sandblasted her down to a fragile, trembling shell. "He just said he was going to the library, Frank," she whispered for the 10th time, her voice raw. "He took his bike. He was supposed to be home for dinner." Frank ran a hand over his thinning hair. "We've checked the library. We've checked with all his friends. We put out a bolo on the bike. Nothing. It's like he just vanished." The word hung in the air, heavy and poisonous, vanished. It was a word that had haunted Harmony Creek for 27 years. A word inextricably linked to Sarah Jenkins. Frank had been a rookie then, a fresh-faced deputy full of piss and vinegar. The Jenkins case had been his baptism by fire, a failure that had burrowed deep into his soul and never left. He remembered the yellow Mustang, the homecoming dress, the frantic, fruitless searches. He remembered the collective grief that had smothered the town. And he remembered Will Peterson. Even now, the name left a sour taste in his mouth. Will the Thrill Peterson. Back then, he was the town's golden boy, the star quarterback with the movie star smile and the full-ride scholarship to a Division I school. He was untouchable. He'd played the part of the grieving boyfriend to perfection. His tearful pleas on the local news, his tireless efforts leading the volunteer search parties, he'd been a pillar of strength. The whole town had wrapped its arms around him. But Frank had always had a doubt. A small, persistent splinter of suspicion he could never quite dig out. Will's story was too smooth, too polished. The argument he claimed they'd had was trivial. Something about a song on the radio. He'd been the last person to see Sarah alive, yet his alibi for the rest of the night was flimsy. He'd gone home, alone, and fallen asleep. No one could confirm it. But he was Will Peterson, and in Harmony Creek, his word was gospel. After the search wound down, Will had left for college, his departure framed as a tragic escape from the ghosts of his past. He'd had a respectable, if not stellar, college football career, then returned to Harmony Creek a few years later, not as a conquering hero, but as a businessman. He'd inherited his father's construction company, Peterson & Sons, and transformed it into the most powerful and influential business in the county. He built the new subdivisions, the strip malls, the town hall. He was on the city council. He was married to a former homecoming queen from a neighboring town, had 2 perfect kids, and lived in a sprawling mansion on the hill overlooking the very town he owned, both literally and figuratively. He was no longer the thrill. He was Mr. Peterson, a man of power and influence. His past tragedy, now just a part of his mythos, a testament to his resilience. Frank's phone buzzed, jolting him from his reverie. It was dispatch. "Got a ping, Frank." From the missing boy's phone, it was a brief one, just a flicker, but we got a location. Maria shot up, her eyes wide with a desperate hope. Where is he?" The dispatcher's voice was hesitant. The signal was weak, but it triangulated to the edge of the tangle. North of the old mill, the tangle. The cold dread in Frank's gut intensified. No kid went into the tangle willingly, especially not at dusk. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice grim. He looked at Maria, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "We're going to find him." As Frank sped towards the river, another person in Harmony Creek was staring at a screen. Her heart a cold, tight knot of fear. Her name was Eleanor Vance, and she was the town librarian, a woman who had cultivated a life of quiet invisibility. She was a ghost in her own life, moving through the stacks of books, her presence as soft and unnoticed as the dust on the forgotten volumes. But Eleanor had a secret she had carried for 27 years, a burden that had hollowed her out from the inside. On the night of the 1995 homecoming dance, Eleanor, then a shy, awkward teenager with a hopeless crush on Will Peterson, hadn't been at the dance. She'd been parked at Lover's Leap, the lookout point that offered a panoramic view of the town and the winding river below. She'd been crying, nursing the fresh wound of seeing Will with the radiant Sarah Jenkins. A girl who seemed to have everything Eleanor didn't. She saw the flash of pale yellow headlights coming up the winding road. It was Sarah's Mustang, but it wasn't Sarah driving, it was Will. And Sarah was in the passenger seat, her head slumped against the window. Eleanor had thought she was sleeping. The Mustang didn't stop at the lookout. It continued on, down the dark, unpaved service road that led towards the tangle. Eleanor had waited. An hour went by. 2. She was about to leave when she saw him again. Will Peterson, walking back up the service road, alone. He was covered in mud, his tuxedo jacket was torn, and there was a dark, frantic look in his eyes she had never seen before. He hadn't seen her, hidden in the shadows of her parents' old station wagon. He got into his own truck, which had been parked further down the road, and sped away. The next day, the news broke. Sarah Jenkins was missing. Fear, sharp and suffocating, had paralyzed Eleanor. She was the hidden witness. She knew Will's story about Sarah driving off in a huff was a lie. He had been the one driving the car, and he had taken it towards the tangle. But she was a nobody. He was Will Peterson. Who would believe her? He would deny it. He would destroy her. Her parents, timid and terrified of making waves, had urged her to stay silent. "It's not our business, Ellie," her father had said, his voice trembling. "The Petersons are powerful people. You don't cross them." And so, she had stayed silent. The secret had become her prison. The memory of that night, a film that played on a loop in her mind, the yellow car, the slumped figure, the mud-caked boy walking out of the darkness. She had watched Will Peterson build his empire on a foundation of lies, his success a constant, bitter reminder of her own cowardice. The guilt had been a cancer, eating away at her life, leaving her a shell of a person, afraid of her own shadow. Now she sat in the dim light of her small apartment above the library, the news of the missing boy, Leo Miller, a terrifying echo of the past. She had seen the boy in the library just yesterday, his face buried in a book about local history. He had asked her about the tangle. He had asked her about Sarah Jenkins. A new, more potent fear gripped her. What if the boy had found something? What if he had gone to the tangle? She opened her laptop, her fingers trembling as she typed Harmony Creek Tangle into the search bar. The first result was a news article about the missing boy. The second was a link to Google Earth. Her breath caught. She clicked the link, the satellite image of her town loading on the screen. She navigated to the tangle, her heart pounding. She zoomed in, just as Leo had done. And she saw it. The same unnatural shape, the same pale, oblong form half buried in the mud. The car, it had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, just waiting for someone to look. The secret she had carried for 27 years was no longer just hers. The boy had found it. And now the boy was missing. Eleanor knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Will Peterson was involved. The past was not dead. It wasn't even past. It had been lying dormant, buried in the mud, and now it was clawing its way back to the surface. And it was coming for her. Frank Miller's SUV skidded to a halt at the trailhead. The woods were swarming with deputies and volunteers, their flashlights cutting frantic, useless patterns in the oppressive darkness. The air was thick with the buzz of mosquitoes and fear. He grabbed his high-powered flashlight and plunged into the woods, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. Anything, he yelled, to the first deputy he saw. Found his bike, Frank, ditched right here. And this. The deputy held up a Ziploc bag. Inside was a single mud-caked sneaker. Leo's. They followed the faint trail of footprints, a trail that grew more erratic and desperate as it neared the river. It was a trail of flight and pursuit. There were other tracks, heavier, from a work boot, with a distinctive tread. He wasn't alone, Frank said, his voice tight. Someone was chasing him. They found the spot on the riverbank soon after. The place where the mud was churned up, the site of a struggle. And they found the second sneaker. And a small, cheap flashlight, broken. And a cell phone, its screen shattered, lying half-submerged in the black water. Frank's blood ran cold. He knelt, his own flashlight beam sweeping across the scene. This was where it ended. He could feel it. The struggle, the pursuit, the sudden violent end. He looked up, his light tracing the edge of the riverbank, and that's when he saw what Leo had seen. The glint of metal, the unnatural shape. He waded into the sucking mud, ignoring the shouts of his deputies. He pushed aside the hanging willows, his light landing on the blistered, rusted roof of a car. A pale yellow car. "Oh my God," a deputy whispered from behind him. "Is that?" Frank didn't answer. He knew what it was. He had known, somewhere in the deep dark part of his soul, from the moment he heard the word tangle. He moved to the driver's side, his light piercing the black, empty space of the window. He saw the mud-caked interior, the weeds, the decay, and he saw the shoes. The small, white, sequined heels. Sarah Jenkins' car. After 27 years, the discovery was a bombshell, but it brought no relief. It only deepened the horror, because it meant that Leo hadn't just stumbled upon a missing car. He had stumbled upon a murder scene. And the killer. Frank backed away from the car, a terrible, suffocating rage building in his chest. He looked at the shattered phone, at the footprints, at the signs of the desperate struggle. His nephew was gone, and the man who had buried a girl and her car in this watery grave nearly 3 decades ago was the one who had taken him. His gaze drifted from the horrific scene on the riverbank up the hill, through the trees, to the distant, glittering lights of a mansion that overlooked the town, the home of Will Peterson. The doubt he had carried for 27 years was no longer a splinter. It was a shard of glass in his gut. Will Peterson had gotten away with murder once. Frank knew, with a chilling, absolute certainty, that he had done it again. He had silenced the one person who had stumbled upon his secret. The search for a missing boy had just become a hunt for a monster who had been hiding in plain sight, wearing the mask of a founding father, for 27 years, and Frank would tear his whole goddamn town apart to find him. He would burn down Will Peterson's empire, brick by brick if he had to. This wasn't just a case anymore, it was a reckoning. The news of the discovered Mustang hit Harmony Creek like a physical blow. The story was a firestorm, consuming local news, then regional, then national. The homecoming ghost, one headline screamed. Decades-old mystery unearthed by Google Earth. The town's long dormant wound was ripped open, raw and bleeding. For a generation, Sarah Jenkins had been a ghost story, a cautionary tale. Now she was real again. The white heels, pulled from the muddy floor of the Mustang, and displayed in an evidence bag on the news, were a gut punch to everyone who remembered her. They were a symbol of her stolen youth, her stolen life. And in the center of that firestorm was Will Peterson. He played his part with masterful precision. He gave a press conference on the steps of the town hall he had helped build. His wife, a statuesque blonde named Catherine, clinging to his arm. His face, now etched with the distinguished lines of middle age, was a mask of solemn, dignified grief. "This is a day of profound sorrow for all of us who knew and loved Sarah," he said, his voice thick with practiced emotion. "For years we have hoped, we have prayed. This discovery, it ends that hope. But it does not end our memory of the bright, beautiful soul we lost. He paused, looking directly into the cameras, his eyes glistening. My heart also goes out to the Miller family. To think that their son's disappearance is now tragically intertwined with this old wound. It's unthinkable. I have pledged the full resources of my company to aid the sheriff's department in their search for young Leo. We will not rest until he is brought home. It was a virtuoso performance. He was the grieving friend, the concerned citizen, the town patriarch. Harmony Creek, desperate for a hero in the face of renewed horror, wept with him. They praised his strength, his resilience. The narrative was set. Will Peterson, the man who had already suffered so much, was once again stepping up to lead his community through the darkness. But Frank Miller wasn't buying it. He watched the press conference from his cluttered office, a bitter, metallic taste in his mouth. Resources, he muttered, slamming his fist on the desk. He's not offering resources. He's controlling the scene. Peterson's construction crews had descended on the tangle like an occupying army. They built a secure access road overnight. They erected fences and brought in massive pumps to drain the section of the riverbank where the Mustang was found. It was all done under the guise of assisting the investigation, but Frank knew it for what it was, a hostile takeover. Peterson's men were everywhere, their presence a constant, intimidating barrier. They controlled who came and went. They logged every vehicle, every person. The crime scene was no longer Frank's, it was Will's. The tension between the two men was a taut, vibrating wire. They met daily at the site, a pantomime of cooperation for the benefit of the deputies and the ever-present media. Any progress on the forensics, Frank Will would ask, his tone oozing with false concern, his expensive suit immaculate even in the muddy clearing. We're working on it, Will, Frank would reply, his voice tight, his eyes scanning the faces of Peterson's crew, looking for a flicker of fear, a sign of complicity. He was certain one of these men had helped Will that night, 27 years ago. And maybe again, just a few nights ago. The initial forensics from the Mustang were heartbreaking, but yielded few new leads. The interior was too degraded, contaminated by decades of river water and silt. They found Sarah's purse, its contents a mush of decayed leather and paper. They found a single, tarnished, silver earring, but they found no DNA, no fingerprints, nothing that could survive 27 years underwater. The car was a coffin, but the killer had left no signature. The search for Leo was just as fruitless. They'd combed every inch of the tangle. They'd used dogs, drones, thermal images. They found nothing. No more clothing, no blood trail, no body. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The official theory was that he had fallen into the river and been swept away. But Frank knew better. Leo hadn't fallen. He'd been taken, and the man who took him was orchestrating the search. The pressure on Frank was immense. The state police were offering to take over. The media was painting him as a small-town cop in over his head, and his sister's hope was dissolving into a terrifying, hollow-eyed despair. Every night he had to face her, and every night he had to tell her there was nothing new. He felt like he was failing her, failing Leo. Just as he had failed Sarah Jenkins. His frustration boiled over into quiet, desperate acts of defiance. He started digging into Will Peterson's life, pulling old files, re-interviewing people from the 1995 investigation. But it was like punching a ghost. People's memories were faded, softened by time. And no one, absolutely no one, wanted to say a bad word about the man who signed their paychecks, who funded their schools, who held the mortgage on their town's future. Will Peterson wasn't just a man anymore, he was an institution. To question him was to question Harmony Creek itself. Frank's focus shifted to the work boot print found at the scene of Leo's disappearance. It was a specific brand, a high-end model, popular with construction workers. He got a warrant to search the employee records for Peterson and Sons. Hoping for a match, he went to the company's main office to serve the warrant himself. Will met him in the lobby, his smile as polished and impenetrable as the marble floor. "Frank," he said, extending a hand. "Whatever you need. I need your employee purchase logs for work boots for the last 2 years, Frank said, ignoring the handshake. Will's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something cold and hard passed through his eyes. Of course, my foreman, Hank, will get that for you. Is this about that footprint you found? A real long shot, isn't it? You don't solve cases by not taking the long shots, Will. Right, Will said, his voice dripping with condescension. You solve them by finding the actual evidence. Tell me, Frank, how's that going? Found anything in that rusted-out piece of junk that I didn't already tell you 27 years ago? That Sarah was upset, that she drove off. This whole thing has been terribly painful to relive. He placed a hand over his heart. But I'm a survivor. We all have to be. The foreman, a burly stoic man named Hank, who looked like he'd been carved from the same granite as the surrounding mountains, led Frank to a records room. Hank had been with Peterson & Sons since the beginning, a loyal dog at the heel of his master. His face was an unreadable mask. As he handed over the files, his eyes met Frank's for a brief second. There was no fear in them. There was nothing. It was like looking at a stone wall. The records were a dead end. Dozens of employees had purchased the same boots. It was a needle in a haystack, and Will knew it. He was toying with him, letting him chase his tail, while he remained untouchable, wrapped in a cocoon of power and public adoration. Meanwhile, in her small apartment above the library, Eleanor Vance was living in a state of escalating terror. Every time a floorboard creaked, every time the phone rang, she jumped. She saw Will Peterson's face everywhere, on TV, on the newspaper, on the We Support Leo Miller posters his company had plastered all over town. To her, his face was not the face of a grieving benefactor. It was the face of the mud-streaked boy walking out of the darkness, his eyes burning with a killer's secret. She knew she was the only person alive who knew the truth of that night. She was the loose thread that could unravel everything for him. And now that the car had been found, she was no longer just a witness. She was a liability. The intimidation began subtly. A car, a black SUV with tinted windows, parked across the street from the library for hours at a time. It was always there when she left for work, and it was there when she came home. One night, she came home to find her apartment door unlocked. Nothing was taken, nothing was disturbed. But the message was clear. I can get to you whenever I want. She stopped sleeping. Her world shrank to the space between her apartment and the library. The books, once her sanctuary, now felt like tombs. She would stare at the phone, her hand hovering over it, her heart hammering. She had to call Detective Miller. She had to tell him what she saw. But the fear, cold and paralyzing, held her back. The memory of her father's warning, "A powerful people, you don't cross them," was a mantra of terror in her mind. The cruelty escalated. One morning, she found a dead bird on her doorstep, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle. The next day, a package arrived. Inside was a single, mud-caked, sequined white high heel. Not a real one from the crime scene, but a replica. A message, a threat so specific, so personal, it shattered what little courage she had left. This was Will's work. It had his signature style, cruel, theatrical, and designed to inflict the maximum amount of psychological terror. He wasn't just trying to silence her, he was enjoying it. He was the cat, and she was the mouse, and he was savoring the slow, torturous game. The breaking point came a week after Leo's disappearance. Eleanor was closing the library, her hands shaking as she locked the heavy oak doors. As she turned, the black SUV pulled up to the curb, its engine a low, menacing purr. The passenger window slid down. It was Hank, Will Peterson's foreman. His face was impassive, his eyes like chips of flint. "Evening, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Mr. Peterson asked me to give you something." He held out a thick manila envelope. Eleanor stared at it, frozen. "Take it," Hank said, his voice hardening slightly. Her hand trembled as she took the envelope. It was heavy. She could feel the outline of a book inside. "He said you should read it," Hank continued. "He said it might refresh your memory about the importance of keeping quiet." About what happens to people who tell stories. He didn't need to say anything else. The threat was as clear as the cold night air. The window slid up, and the SUV pulled away, disappearing. Into the darkness, Eleanor stumbled back to her apartment, her heart a wild bird trapped in her chest. She locked the door, drew the curtains, and sank to the floor. With trembling fingers, she tore open the envelope. Inside was a book. A high school yearbook, the 1995 Harmony Creek High Yearbook, and a single glossy photograph. It was a picture of her, from that year. A candid shot she'd never seen before. She was sitting alone at a lunch table, her face buried in a book, her expression one of profound, painful loneliness. Scrawled across the bottom of the photo, in thick black marker, were 2 words. Nobody cares. A sob, ragged and broken, tore from her throat. It was the distillation of her entire life, of her deepest fear. That she was a nobody. That her voice didn't matter. That her truth was worthless. This was Will's genius. He knew her weakness. He knew her fear. And he was using it to crush her. But as she sat there on the floor, the photograph in her hand, something inside her shifted. The terror was still there, a cold coiling snake in her gut. But now, it was mixed with something else, incandescent rage. He had terrorized her for 27 years with his silence. Now he was terrorizing her with his words, with his power, with his ghosts. He had taken Sarah's life. He had taken Leo's, and he had taken hers, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left, almost. She looked at the picture of the lonely, scared girl at the lunch table. He was right. She had been a nobody. She had let him make her a nobody. But she wasn't that girl anymore. The fear had hollowed her out, but the rage was starting to fill the empty spaces. He thought he had broken her. He thought he had silenced her for good. But he had made a mistake. He had pushed her too far. He had shown her his hand. And in doing so, he had given her the one thing she hadn't had for 27 years, a reason to fight back. She had nothing left to lose. He had already taken it all. She stood up, her legs shaky but her resolve hardening into steel. She walked to the phone. She knew the number for the sheriff's department by heart. She had stared at it for a week. This time, she picked it up. This time, she dialed. "Detective Miller, please," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I have information about the night Sarah Jenkins disappeared." Frank Miller drove through the quiet sleeping streets of Harmony Creek, his mind a maelstrom of adrenaline and disbelief. Eleanor Vance, the town librarian. A woman so quiet, so self-effacing, he'd barely known she existed. And she was claiming to be a witness. After 27 years of silence, his first instinct was to dismiss it as a crank call, another dead end in a case full of them. But there was a tremor in her voice, a brittle edge of genuine terror that had made him stop. That had made him listen. He found her in the library, the only light coming from a single green-shaded lamp on the main circulation desk, casting the vast silent room in a cathedral of shadows. She looked like a ghost, pale and trembling, clutching a 1995 yearbook to her chest like a shield. "Thank you for coming, Detective," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ms. Vance," Frank said, keeping his voice gentle, cautious. "You said you have information about the night Sarah Jenkins disappeared." She nodded, her eyes darting towards the darkened windows as if expecting a monster to crash through the glass. "I was there," she said, her voice cracking. "Not at the dance. At Lover's Leap, I saw the car." Frank's heart rate quickened. Sarah's car, the Mustang. Yes, but she wasn't driving. Eleanor's gaze finally met his, and what he saw in her eyes was a fear so profound it was almost tangible. Will Peterson was driving. Sarah was in the passenger seat. She looked like she was asleep, or something else. He didn't stop. He drove down the service road, the one that goes to the Tangle. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. Frank felt a cold shock, a jolt of vindication so strong it almost buckled his knees. His splinter of doubt, The suspicion he had nurtured for 27 years had just become a granite certainty. "And you're sure it was him?" "I'm sure," she breathed. "I saw him again, a couple of hours later, walking back up the road, alone. He was covered in mud. He looked haunted, terrified." She finally lowered the yearbook, her hands shaking as she opened it. "He knows I saw him. He's been threatening me. Trying to keep me quiet." She explained everything: the black SUV, the unlocked door, the dead bird, and finally, the package. She pushed the yearbook and the photograph across the desk. Frank stared. At the image of the lonely teenage girl, at the cruel scrawled message, "Nobody cares." A cold, hard rage settled in Frank's gut. This was pure, sadistic evil. This was Will Peterson's signature. It wasn't just about covering up a crime. It was about the deliberate, psychological destruction of another human being. He had been torturing this woman for decades, first with his silence, now with his power. "Why now, Ms. Vance?" Frank asked, his voice soft. "Why after all this time?" "Because of the boy," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Leo, he came in here the day before he disappeared. He was asking about Sarah, about the tangle. I think he found the car, and I think Will found him. He's not just a killer, detective, he's a monster, and he won't stop. He'll just keep burying his secrets, no matter who he has to bury with them." Frank looked at the terrified woman before him. She was the key. Her testimony shattered Will Peterson's alibi. It placed him at the scene, driving the victim's car towards the place it would be found 27 years later. It was the break he had been praying for. But it was also her word against his. The word of a reclusive librarian against the town's most powerful man. Peterson's lawyers would tear her apart on the stand. They would paint her as an obsessed, delusional spinster with a vendetta. He needed more. He needed something undeniable. "Ms. Vance." "Eleanor," he said, his voice firm. "What you've done takes incredible courage. But we need to be smart. He knows you're a threat. He's going to escalate. We need to get you somewhere safe. And we need to get something on him," Frank thought. Something he can't deny. The next morning, Frank put Eleanor in protective custody, moving her to a safe house in the next county. Then, he went to see the one person he knew who hated Will Peterson with a passion that rivaled his own. But for different reasons. Marcus Thorne was a disgraced journalist. He'd run the Harmony Creek Herald until Peterson had bought it, gutted it, and turned it into a mouthpiece for his own interests. Now, Thorne published a muckraking blog from his basement, a relentless, often rambling crusade against the Peterson empire. Most people dismissed him as a crank. But Frank knew he was a damn good investigator. Frank found him hunched over a laptop, the room littered with stacks of paper and empty coffee cups. "Miller," Thorne grunted, not looking up. "Come to shut me down for good." "I've come to give you the story of a lifetime," Frank said. He laid it all out: Eleanor's testimony, the threats, his own long-held suspicions. Thorne listened, his cynical eyes widening with each detail. When Frank was finished, the journalist leaned back, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Will Peterson," he breathed, "I knew it. I always knew he was a snake, but a murderer. This is the motherlode." "It's not a story yet, Marcus," Frank warned. "It's an accusation. I need proof, something concrete. I'm going after his financials, his phone records, but he's smart, he's covered his tracks. I need something from the past, something he might have forgotten about." "The past," Thorne mused, his eyes gleaming. "People think they can bury the past, but it always leaves a trace, a piece of paper, a forgotten file, a disgruntled employee." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You mentioned his foreman, Hank, the loyal dog. Men like that, they're loyal, but they're also meticulous. They're the ones who know where the real bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking. Or maybe," he added with a grim smile, "literally." The idea took root in Frank's mind. Hank, the stone wall, the man who had been at Will's side since the beginning. If anyone knew Will's secrets, it was him. But breaking him would be impossible. His loyalty was absolute. Or was it? Frank pulled the employee records he'd gotten from Peterson and Sons. He found Hank's file. He'd been with the company for years, a model employee. But as Frank scanned the documents, something caught his eye. A medical leave of absence. 6 weeks. Dated October 1995, just 2 weeks after Sarah Jenkins disappeared. The reason listed was a workplace accident, a fall from a scaffold, a broken leg and several fractured ribs. A cold realization dawned on Frank. A workplace accident, or a convenient story to explain injuries sustained during a struggle. A way to keep a key accomplice out of sight while the town was searching and questions were being asked. He needed to get into Peterson's main office. He knew that's where the old records would be. The pre-digital files from 1995, the real story of Hank's accident, might be in there. But he had no grounds for a warrant. Not yet. That's where Marcus Thorne came in. "I need a distraction," Frank said. "A big one. Something to pull Will and his security away from the main office for a few hours." Thorne grinned. "A distraction? Frank, I'm going to give you a goddamn circus." The next afternoon, Thorne published a blog post. It was a masterpiece of insinuation and carefully worded accusations. It didn't name Eleanor Vance, but it spoke of a long silent witness and a secret kept for 27 years. It didn't directly accuse Will Peterson of murder, but it asked pointed questions about his whereabouts on the night of the homecoming dance, about the Mustang, about the tangle. It was journalistic dynamite. That post exploded online. Within an hour, it was the only thing anyone in Harmony Creek was talking about. The media, smelling blood in the water, descended on the town hall, on Peterson's office, on his home. The narrative of the grieving patriarch began to crack. Will Peterson was forced to call another press conference to denounce the slanderous, baseless accusations of a failed journalist. As Frank had predicted, he was there, his face a mask of controlled fury, and at his side, looking grim and menacing, was his foreman, Hank. The entire senior management of Peterson and Sons was there. A show of force, a wall of solidarity. That was Frank's window. While the press conference was streaming live, Frank, dressed in a maintenance worker's uniform, slipped into the back entrance of the Peterson and Sons headquarters. The building was a ghost town, all eyes glued to the drama unfolding on TV. Made his way to the basement records room, a dusty, forgotten archive of filing cabinets and banker's boxes. He found the boxes for 1995. His heart pounded as he sifted through the files. The smell of old paper and dust filling his lungs. He found personnel files, invoices, project plans. And then he found a thin folder labeled Workplace Accidents, 1995. Inside was the official report on Hank's fall. It was brief, clinical, but attached to the back of it was something else. A smaller, folded piece of paper. It was a handwritten note, on the personal letterhead of Will Peterson's father, the company's founder. It was addressed to the company's doctor at the time, a man long since retired. Frank's hands trembled as he read the note. "Dr. Evans, please see to it that Hank is taken care of. His injuries are extensive. He needs to be kept comfortable and, more importantly, quiet." This was not a workplace accident. This was a personal matter that got out of hand. Your discretion is, as always, paramount. The company will, of course, handle all expenses and ensure you are compensated for your FLEXIBILITYW Peterson. Sr. Frank stared at the note, his blood running cold. This was it, the smoking gun. A personal matter that got out of hand. It was a confession, written in the coded language of the powerful. Hank hadn't fallen from a scaffold. He had been injured the night Sarah Jenkins was killed. He had been there. He had helped Will, and Will's father had helped cover it up, burying the truth in a secret file. A secret that had been waiting in the dark for 27 years. But, as he stood there, the note in his hand, a new, more horrifying thought began to form. The note mentioned extensive injuries, a broken leg, fractured ribs. That was more than a simple struggle. That implied a fight, a violent one. What if Sarah hadn't been the only victim that night? What if she had fought back? Frank's mind raced, replaying Eleanor's words. She looked like she was asleep. Or something else. What if Will hadn't been able to control her? What if, in a fit of rage, he had attacked her, and Hank had tried to intervene? Or what if Hank was the one who had gotten violent, and Will had been forced to silence him as well? No, that didn't make sense. Hank was still alive, still loyal. Frank's eyes scanned the note again. He needs to be kept quiet. The conspiracy was deeper than he had imagined. It wasn't just Will. It was his father. It was the company doctor. It was Hank. A wall of silence, built on money and power and fear. To protect the golden boy. And then, his gaze fell upon another document in the file, tucked behind the accident report. It was a receipt. An invoice from a local auto body shop, dated 2 days after the homecoming dance. It was for a series of repairs to a 1994 Ford pickup truck. Will Peterson's truck. The repairs were listed in detail. Repair and repaint deep. Scratches along passenger side door. Replace shattered passenger side window. Steam clean and detail interior upholstery to remove significant staining. Staining. Frank felt a wave of nausea. The story Will had told, the story everyone had believed, was that he and Sarah had a small argument and she had driven off alone. But this receipt told a different story. It told a story of a violent struggle. A struggle that had happened not in Sarah's car, but in his, the shattered window, the deep scratches, the staining on the upholstery. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The argument hadn't been at the dance. It had happened later, in Will's truck. He had attacked her there. Maybe she had fought back, tried to get out, shattering the window, the scratches on the door. Had they been from her fingernails? He had killed her in his own truck. The Mustang was a decoy. A prop. He had driven her car to the tangle and buried it to create a false trail, to make it look like she had simply run off and vanished. He had concocted the story of the argument, the story of her driving away, to cement the lie, and his father, his foreman, his entire network had helped him sell it. But what about Leo? Where did he fit in? Frank's phone buzzed, dragging him back to the present. It was a text from one of his deputies. Frank, we got something. The lab just finished. The analysis on the soil samples from the tread of Leo's sneakers. Besides the river mud from the tangle, they found traces of something else. Industrial lime, specific chemical solvents, and human decomposition explorants. The kind used in construction and waste disposal. Frank read the text again. The words blurring. Industrial lime, decomposition accelerants. His eyes fell on a set of blueprints, rolled up in a corner of the records room. The label on the tube read, Harmony Creek Town Center and Plaza Phase, 11996. It was Will Peterson's flagship project, the one that had cemented his reputation as the town's savior. A massive new development, built on what used to be a patch of undeveloped wasteland on the edge of town. Frank felt the floor drop out from beneath him. The body, Sarah's body, it was never in the car. The car was a ghost, a misdirection. He had buried her somewhere else. Somewhere no one would ever think to look. Somewhere that would be sealed under thousands of tons of concrete and steel a year later. And Leo. Leo hadn't just found the car. He had found the man who buried it. And that man, that monster, couldn't risk his new secret being discovered. The soil on Leo's shoes, it wasn't from the tangle, it was from the place Will had taken him. A construction site, a place with lime and solvents, a new grave. The full monstrous scope of the conspiracy was laid bare in the dusty silence of the records room. 2 murders, 27 years apart. An empire built on a buried body. A town square, the very heart of Harmony Creek, that was a secret. Unmarked tomb. The stakes had just shifted from a cold case to a scandal that would not just destroy Will Peterson. It would shatter the very foundation of the town he had built. Frank grabbed the file, the note, the receipt. He had the proof. He had the truth. Now, he just had to bring a monster to justice and find what was left of his nephew. The air in the Harmony Creek Town Council chamber was thick with tension and the cloying scent of cheap air freshener. It was a special emergency session, called by Will Peterson himself. He stood at the podium, a portrait of calm, righteous indignation. The television lights glinting off his perfectly coiffed hair. The room was packed. On one side sat the council members. His council members, their faces a mixture of support and nervous apprehension. On the other, the press, a pack of wolves sensing a kill. In the back, the public, the citizens of Harmony Creek, their faces a sea of confusion, anger, and dawning horror. Will's voice boomed through the chamber, filled with the easy confidence of a man who had never known anything but power. And let me be clear, he was saying, his gaze sweeping across the room. These allegations, published by a disgraced obsessive blogger, are not just an attack on me. They are an attack on this town, an attack on our progress, an attack on our shared history. He was trying to frame it, to control the narrative one last time. He was Will Peterson, the builder, the patriarch. The accusations were an outside threat, a cancer to be excised. He was positioning himself as the town's defender. It was at that precise moment that the main doors of the chamber swung open. Every head turned, the cameras swiveled. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Detective Frank Miller walked in. He was not alone. Flanked by 2 state troopers in full uniform, he walked slowly, deliberately, down the center aisle. His face was grim, his eyes locked on the man at the podium. The air crackled, the silence so profound you could hear the hum of the TV cameras. Will Peterson froze, his hand gripping the edge of the podium. For the first time, a flicker of genuine shock, of raw fear, broke through his carefully constructed mask. He hadn't expected this. Not here. Not in his chamber. Not in his town. Frank, Will said, his voice a strained, unnatural imitation of his usual bonhomie. What is the meaning of this? This is a private council meeting. It's over, Will, Frank said, his voice low and clear, yet carrying to every corner of the silent room. He stopped at the foot of the dais, looking up at the man who had haunted his life for 27 years. I don't know what you're talking about, Will blustered, trying to regain control. If you have something to say, you can make an appointment with my lawyer. Now, I demand that you have a warrant for your arrest, Frank said, cutting him off. He held up the paper, the black letters stark against the white. For the murder of Sarah Jenkins in 1995, and for the murder of Leo Miller 3 weeks ago. A wave of shock and horror washed over the room. Cries of disbelief, of outrage. The reporters surged forward, a chaotic frenzy of shouted questions and flashing cameras. The council members looked at Will, their faces pale, the foundation of their world crumbling beneath them. This is insane, Will yelled, his voice cracking, the mask of composure shattering. You have no proof. You have nothing. We have everything, Frank said, his voice like ice. He turned slightly, nodding towards the doors. They opened again, and Eleanor Vance walked in. She was no longer the trembling ghost from the library. She was flanked by 2 more troopers, but she walked with her head held high, her gaze fixed on Will Peterson. The fear was still in her eyes, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. Hello, Will, she said, her voice clear and steady. Do you remember me? I was at Lover's Leap. I saw you. Will stared at her, his face ashen. He looked like he had seen a ghost. The ghost of the girl he had dismissed as a nobody. The girl he had terrorized into silence, now standing before him as his accuser. She's lying, he spat, his eyes wild. She's a delusional, obsessed. We also have this, Frank said, his voice cutting through the chaos. He held up a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a folded yellowed piece of paper, a note, from your father, to your family doctor. About your foreman Hank's workplace accident, it says, and I quote, "This was a personal matter that got out of hand. It talks about keeping him quiet, about paying for flexibility." Frank paused, letting the words sink in. He saw the flicker of panic in Will's eyes as he glanced at the back of the room, looking for his loyal dog. But Hank wasn't there. "Oh, you're looking for Hank?" Frank asked, his voice laced with cold satisfaction. "We picked him up an hour ago. He was surprisingly cooperative once we showed him this note, and the perjury charges he was facing for lying about his accident." His memory suddenly got a lot clearer. He remembers everything, Will. He remembers you calling him that night, frantic. He remembers helping you move the Mustang. He remembers the fight. Frank took a step closer to the podium, his voice dropping to a low, intense growl. "But here's the thing you didn't count on, Will. You were so clever, burying the car, creating this whole narrative. But you got sloppy. 27 years later, you got sloppy." He held up a second evidence bag. This one contained a receipt, an invoice from an auto body shop, dated 2 days after Sarah disappeared, for repairs to your truck. A shattered passenger window, deep scratches on the door, and a bill for steam cleaning the upholstery to remove, and again, I quote, "significant staining. You didn't kill her in the Mustang, did you, Will? You killed her in your truck." And Sarah fought back. The room was in an uproar. Will Peterson, his face slick with sweat, backed away from the podium, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal, looking for an escape that wasn't there. State troopers moved in, their hands on their weapons. "But that's not all." Frank's voice boomed, silencing the crowd once more. "The worst part, the most monstrous part, is what you did next. You didn't just bury a car, Will, you buried a body. Sarah's body." He pointed a finger not at Will, but through the large window of the council chamber, towards the center of town. "You buried her under this town's future. You buried her under the foundation of your greatest achievement, the Harmony Creek Town Center. We have the soil analysis, Will. From Leo Miller's shoes, he didn't just find the car, he found you. You were moving evidence at one of your new construction sites, and he stumbled upon you, and you silenced him. Just like you silenced Sarah." Frank turned to the cameras, to the people of Harmony Creek, his voice filled with a raw, righteous fury. "This man, this pillar of our community, built his empire on the grave of a 17-year-old girl. The heart of our town is a tomb." That was the breaking point. The dam of denial and disbelief burst. The public, the people who had trusted him, who had voted for him, who had worked for him, turned on him. The air filled with shouts of "Monster! Killer! Where is the boy?" Will Peterson finally broke. His face contorted into a mask of pure, snarling hatred. He lunged, not at Frank, but towards Eleanor. "You," he screamed, his voice a raw, inhuman sound. "You were nothing, a nobody. I should have killed you too." The troopers tackled him before he could take 2 steps, slamming him face first onto the floor of the chamber he had commanded for so long. The sound of his head hitting the polished wood echoed through the room. They wrenched his arms behind his back, the sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs sealing his fate, as they hauled him to his feet. A pathetic, defeated shell of a man, his eyes met Frank's. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, bottomless despair. The empire had fallen. The king was dethroned. Frank felt a grim, hollow satisfaction. He had done it. He had brought the monster down. But it wasn't over. One question remained, a question that twisted in his gut like a knife. He leaned down, his face inches from Will's. "Where is he?" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous whisper for Will's ears only. "Where is my nephew?" Will Peterson just laughed, a broken gurgling sound. "You'll never find him," he rasped, a final defiant act of cruelty. "He's part of the foundation now. Just like Sarah." The troopers dragged him away, a screaming, pathetic animal. His threats and curses echoing down the marble hallway until they were finally silenced by the closing doors. The chamber was a scene of chaos. Reporters were shouting, people were crying. The council members sat in stunned, ashen-faced silence. Frank walked over to Eleanor, who was being comforted by a female officer. She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, but also with a light he hadn't seen before. The light of freedom. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Eleanor. You're the hero today. You were never a nobody." He walked out of the chamber, away from the noise and the chaos. He had won. Justice for Sarah Jenkins had finally been served, in the most public, explosive way imaginable. The truth was out. The monster was in a cage. But as he stood on the steps of the town hall, looking out at the town square, at the fountain, and the benches and the memorial plaques, all he could feel was a cold, aching emptiness. The cinematic payoff was complete, the public justice delivered. But his boy was still missing. He was part of the foundation. A ghost in his own town, buried under the weight of a monster's secrets. The victory felt sickeningly hollow. The real price of this truth was yet to be paid, and Frank knew, with a father's certainty and a detective's dread, that the search was not over. It had just entered its most heartbreaking and final chapter. The aftermath of Will Peterson's arrest was a slow, agonizing demolition, not just of buildings, but of a town's identity. The Harmony Creek Town Center, the symbol of prosperity and civic pride, became a place of morbid pilgrimage. The national media lingered for weeks, their satellite trucks a permanent fixture, their reporters interviewing shell-shocked residents who now looked at the familiar brick plaza with a mixture of horror and revulsion. Will Peterson, denied bail, confessed. Not out of remorse, but out of a final desperate attempt to control the narrative. His confession, delivered through his high priest lawyer, was a chilling, self-pitying monologue. He painted Sarah Jenkins as a tease who had pushed him too far. Her death, a tragic accident born of youthful passion. He spoke of his father's pressure to uphold the family name, framing the cover-up as an act of filial duty. He was the victim, he claimed, a man burdened by a single terrible mistake. He was less forthcoming about Leo. He stuck to his final, cruel words to Frank. He's part of the foundation now. He refused to give up the location. A final sadistic twist of the knife to the Miller family. The search for Leo became an archaeological dig, based on the soil analysis and a frantic re-examination of construction logs from Peterson's newest development site, a half-finished luxury condo complex on the other side of town. The investigators zeroed in on a single massive concrete support pillar for the underground parking garage. Frank Miller stood and watched, a hollowed-out man running on caffeine and grief, as the demolition crew began their work. His sister, Maria, stood beside him, wrapped in a blanket, despite the mild autumn air, her face a blank mask of unspeakable sorrow. They watched as the jackhammers pounded, as the concrete dust plumed into the air, as the steel rebar was cut and pulled away like the ribs of some great dead beast. It took 2 days. 2 days of the relentless, grinding noise of destruction. Each blow of the hammer, a fresh wound in Frank's soul. On the evening of the second day, the work stopped. A foreman approached Frank, his face pale, his eyes averted. "Detective," he said, his voice low. I think you need to see this." Frank walked to the edge of the pit, his legs feeling like lead. Maria stayed behind, unable to take those final steps. He looked down. There, in the rubble of the demolished pillar, was a shape. A small shape, wrapped in industrial plastic sheeting, bound with duct tape. A shape the size of a teenage boy. He had found him. He had brought his nephew home. But there was no relief in it, only a vast, silent, screaming emptiness. The foundation had given up its dead. The funerals were held a week apart. Sarah Jenkins was finally laid to rest, her original empty casket replaced by one that held her recovered remains. The whole town, it seemed, turned out, a community trying to atone for 27 years of willful ignorance. Eleanor Vance was there, standing quietly in the back, no longer a ghost, but a woman finding her place in the light. Leo's funeral was smaller, more private. A heartbreaking gathering of family and friends, of teenagers who couldn't comprehend the loss of one of their own. Frank stood by the graveside, watching as the small casket was lowered into the earth, and felt a grief so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. He had solved the case. He had caught the killer. But he had lost the one thing that mattered. Most he had failed to protect his family. In the months that followed, Harmony Creek tried to heal. The town council was dissolved, its members resigning in disgrace. Peterson and Sons was dismantled, its assets seized and sold off. The town square was officially renamed. It was now the Sarah Jenkins and Leo Miller Memorial Plaza. But no one called it that. They called it the Tomb. It was a place of quiet reflection, a place where teenagers would leave flowers and handwritten notes. It was a scar on the face of the town, a permanent reminder of the secrets it had kept. Will Peterson was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Hank, for his role as an accomplice after the fact, received a lesser sentence. The news was a brief final headline in a story that the world was already beginning to forget. One crisp, late autumn afternoon, a year after it all began, Frank Miller stood in the Memorial Plaza. The leaves of the maple trees were a brilliant, fiery red, the color of shed blood. He stood before a newly erected monument, a simple, elegant slab of polished black granite. On it were etched 2 names, 2 dates, and a single sentence. The truth will out. He traced his nephew's name with his finger, the cold stone offering no comfort. He thought about the boy's insatiable curiosity, the way he used to fly around the world on his computer, looking for secrets in the pixels. He had found one. The biggest, darkest secret of them all. And it had cost him his life. A shadow fell beside him. He turned. It was Eleanor Vance. She was carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Hello, detective," she said, her voice soft. "Eleanor," he replied, managing a weak smile. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 survivors bound by a shared trauma. She had found her voice, her courage. She was taking classes at the local community college, she told him. She was thinking of becoming a paralegal. "I want to help people who don't have a voice," she said. She placed her flowers at the base of the monument. "He was a hero, you know," she said quietly. "Leo, he was just a boy, but he was braver than all of us." Frank nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Yeah," he whispered. He was as Eleanor walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Frank looked up at the sky, a brilliant, cloudless blue. He imagined the satellites, invisible and silent, circling the earth, their unblinking eyes seeing everything. They saw the towns and the rivers, the houses and the cars. They saw the secrets buried in the mud. They saw the foundations of lies. He thought about the cost of truth. It had cost Sarah her life. It had cost Leo his. It had cost Eleanor her youth. It had cost him a part of his soul. But the truth, once unearthed, could not be buried. It was out. It was free. And in the end, in the quiet, heartbreaking aftermath, that was the only victory that mattered. The lingering emotional echo was not one of triumph, but of a profound, bittersweet sorrow. A reminder that some ghosts can never be fully laid to rest, and some foundations, once broken, can never be truly rebuilt. They just become memorials to what was lost.